Okay, several of you have asked for this part because you were traveling in Europe. It's the first section of the first PowerPoint on Antebellum US. Now, antebellum refers to pre-war. It's Latin for before war. So this is a part of American history that is always taught hand in hand with three components of the 19th century. It's antebellum US, the build-up to the Civil War itself, and Reconstruction. So the 19th century is really composed of all of three of these components. This is a very famous political cartoon of the time. There are, of the time, you notice that there is, down at the bottom here, way down here, it talks about, it notes the Democratic platform in Kansas and Cuba, etc. And these caricatures are of various political figures of the time. This is President Van Buren, and these are our other candidates. This is President Pierce. This is meant to be Stephen Douglas. And the idea is that this is, they're shoving slavery down the throat of a free soiler. And a free soiler is not just somebody that perhaps doesn't want slavery or hence free. A lot of land is being made available by the government in the West. And even though it's not metropolitan by any means, the eastern coast is becoming heavily populated. And there's free or very inexpensive land in what is known to these people as the West, which is those areas of the Louisiana Purchase. The second part of that is that for farmers in the South who have depended heavily of their crops of tobacco and then cotton have overused the land, and the land is now not producing well. So they want to move west as well. So that is all part and parcel. Now, if you're in the South and you are moving west, then you want to also take your slaves with you. So to look at the geography a little bit, the map of slavery in 1850 looks very much like this. The yellow is our slave states, the green, free territories, and of course we have the 3630, which is the Missouri Compromise, which is much earlier in the century. So the strife, the political tensions here at this point in time are coming about, yes, from the Founding Fathers and John Adams and everybody, and not being willing to take a closer look at slavery and admitting to putting it off for 20 years. This is a function of wanting to move west and challenging the notion and challenging the legality and challenging the concept of this 3630. Some of the key figures that you'll read about, not only in your text and some of the other assignments, but to understand the time well, there are some key figures that I've picked out. William Lloyd Garrison is literally a radical abolitionist from the North. He wants nothing to do with slavery, and to a degree believes that God has placed him here to rid the country of slavery. Stephen Douglas is a politician who is from Illinois, and Douglas really has eyes on the White House, and certainly, and he would have gotten there most probably had some specific turn of events not come about. Frederick Douglass has his roots in slavery. He has escaped. He has bought his freedom. He escapes to England. He is well educated, comes back to the United States with the understanding and the drive and the fortitude to rid the country of slavery. He is well spoken, and because he is well spoken, is looked at not only by Southerners but Northerners as well as being a black that is, pardon the expression, uppity. Abraham Lincoln is a relatively unknown personality at this point. He has in the 1840s been a U.S. congressman one term. He didn't really care for it. But he's becoming a political figure in Illinois, which places him in contrast or in competition, if you will, with Stephen Douglas. Two very famous women of the time, Harriet Tubman, whose fame becomes the Underground Railroad, or from the Underground Railroad, and Sojourner Truth, who is not only a black and activist and anti-slavery, but she is also a women's rights activist. Make sure that you have read in my famous speeches handout her speech on Ain't I a Woman Too. Additional figures of the time that figure significantly into the antebellum period: a radical John Brown, who is from upstate New York, who organizes himself and his sons, and also of strong Christian belief that he believes that God will support and has put him here on the planet for this, to rid this nation of slavery. Nat Turner and Nat Turner's rebellion is really a flashpoint. There are no known pictures of Nat Turner. He leads a rebellion in the early 19th century, which is bloody. He breaks away with other slaves from their owners in the South and goes on a killing spree and essentially hacks whites, women, and children to their death in their beds. And it causes great consternation among slave owners in the South. John C. Calhoun is a representative and then senator and vice president from South Carolina. He becomes the voice of the South in terms of states' rights. Ultimately, this leads to the Compromise of 1850, and Compromise is exactly that they are seeking to compromise, and we'll discuss what is being compromised. Along the way, the testing grounds for all of this political turmoil and social turmoil is a territory that has been divided up, and that is Kansas. And given that Stephen Douglas proposes this notion of popular sovereignty, which makes a lot of sense. He says, well, look, we should let the territories decide what they want. Kansas becomes the proving ground, and it becomes literally a fight, a social fight, and literally there are battlegrounds there, and it's a mini civil war within a state territory, hence it becomes called Bleeding Kansas. Just briefly, I think it's good to just recognize here that in terms of the numbers of people affected here, that the slave population in the South is not insignificant. Now remember, we have the 3/5 compromise too, so the Southerners depend upon slaves in counting for representation in the House. But also, relative to Nat Turner, please notice here these numbers, that slave population is large. So if you have a large slave population, you have to be concerned about how you're going to control them. So this becomes a very big importance, to the slave masters, the owners. It becomes a well-known thought at the time that a slave is nothing more than property. And this notion and definition is held up in the Dred Scott case later in the 1850s. And the notion of chattel becomes first and foremost of the nomenclature of the time. A chattel is a movable possession. So a slave becomes recognized as nothing more than a horse or a plow. And you can, if you wish, of course, take your possessions anywhere you want. There's no government that should or can be willing or rightly be legal to remove or prevent you from moving your property from one place to the next. Nat Turner's rebellion is significant because it was so bloody. And you can read the details here, but the long and the short of it is that it causes great alarm in the South that blacks could rise up and use tools and axes and hoes to bludgeon their white owners to death. And it leads to making sure that this doesn't happen again. And it leads to all sorts of slave codes and making sure that slaves can't learn to read or communicate. It means that you want to sell them frequently and break up any bands or families that form. And it also causes it is cause for the Virginia Convention of 1831 and 1832, which basically says a group of Virginians are very concerned about what has been going on in the South and are very concerned about their future. Their future is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, the Compromise of 1850. Whenever we speak of of this word, I've always said in class, as you guys know, this means something. Compromise means you give something and you take something that you don't necessarily like. The Compromise of 1850 truly became one of the benchmarks of Senate debate in the entirety of U.S. history. And it pits a Kentuckian, William Clay, and Stephen Douglas, who both have strong aspirations of going to the White House. And the Compromise really centers around the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which of course settles the Mexican War. And here's how this works out. Because of the legislation and because of the Treaty of Guadalupe that we're utilizing money, the Senate and the House become involved, because the Senate and the House, of course, have the ability to expend funds. And that means that, as we've already studied, that means that what would normally be a treaty that's just ratified by the Senate, it means there is room for debate on how this treaty is ratified. And it brings Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, and Henry Clay to the forefront. They are old men. It also lays the groundwork for a new generation of leaders in the Senate, principally Salmon Chase, who will go on to become a principal man in Lincoln's cabinet, as will William Seward. The debates between Stephen Douglas in the 1858 Senate campaign between he and Lincoln are noteworthy for numerous reasons. Jefferson Davis is in the cabinet with presidents, and as tensions rise, he is a senator from Mississippi. The compromise measures of 1850 you can read about. But the key aspect here, for me, that is the source of much of these tensions, is the Wilmot Proviso. It's the first time that people in the North are actually trying to dictate, and that is the correct word, use of land that the government has acquired through either war or territory or purchase. So they're looking at this going, the Southerners are looking at this going, this really is a bad thing for us potentially in the long run. The Compromise of 1850 is a combination of two bills, and you again can read about this. It is 4 measures essentially that talks about the admission of California as a free state, and this is the Compromise. Then Texas and New Mexico territories without restrictions on slavery, the Utah Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, and an act abolishing the slave trade in D.C. And this is a slide to that effect. And again, you can review these slides. What is very important are the slave laws that come about, which tighten during the course of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s what slaves can or cannot do. The Fugitive Slave Act really angers the North because it says that, look, anybody that encounters a fugitive slave is obliged by law to make sure that they get returned. Standing up against that law, uniquely, is the state of Vermont in 1850, which enacts personal liberty laws, and they say, well, we're not going to do it, which puts them very interestingly in the same group as the individuals way back in Jefferson's time, when he talks about the annulment and the Kentucky and Virginia Acts, which speak against Alien and Sedition Acts. And I'm going to skip through these quickly because you can read these well on your own. I will do the next video on John Brown's raids.